Welcome to Shahnameh, Book of Kings. Today we continue with the Reign of Khosrow Parvis. When Khosrow Parvis had been a fearless young man in the period while his father was still alive, he had loved Shirin and had cherished her more than his own sight. In all the world only Shirin pleased him, and he had no eyes for another beautiful woman or for the daughters of the nobility. But then this time was taken up with travel about the world, and by his battles with Bahram. He seemed to have forsaken his love, and the beautiful Shirin wept day and night for him. One day, Parvis decided to go hunting, and the expedition was arranged, as it had been customary with former kings. 300 horses with golden bridles were led out, and there were 1,600 loyal footmen carrying javelins, and 1,400 more who carried staves and swords and wore brocade beneath their armor. Following them came 500 falconers with sparrowhawks, merlins, and falcons, and then 300 horsemen leading cheetahs. There were also leopards and lions whose mouths had been muzzled with gold chains, and 100 dogs with golden leashes for running down deer. After them came 2,000 musicians, all mounted on camels and wearing golden crowns. They had prepared songs to celebrate the hunt. There were thrones, tents, and pavilions loaded on camels, as well as stalls for the animals. There were 200 slaves with censers that burned aloes wood and ambergris, together with 200 young servants carrying narcissus and crocuses, and they carried these so that the wind bore their scent to Parvis. In front of them were men who scattered water in which musk had been mixed, so that the wind would not suddenly stir up the dust and disturb the king. When Shirin heard that this entourage was approaching, with the king at its head, she put on a golden dress scented with musk, and over it a surcoat of red Byzantine brocade with a gold ground worked with jewels. She made her cheeks the color of pomegranates, and on her head she placed a crown of imperial splendor. She went up from her royal throne onto the roof of her palace, and the days of her youth brought her no pleasure. She waited there with the tears trickling down her cheeks until Khosrow Parvis approached. When she saw the king's face, she stood so that she could see her, and she spoke gently to him about their former days. Her eyes were like narcissus that drooped with sorrow, and they bathed her cheeks in rosy color as she wept. Beautiful in tears, she reproachfully addressed the king. "My lord, my warrior, my king, who lives favored by all that heaven's fortune gives, where's your love now? Or your tears that I and I alone could comfort once and dry? Where are the endless nights we turned to day with tears and smiles and amorous sweet play? Where are our oaths and promises, and where are all the vows we vowed we'd always share?" And as she spoke, her tears fell onto her imperial clothes. Tears welled too in Khosrow's eyes, and his face turned as yellow as the sun. He sent a horse with a golden bridle for her, and 40 reliable Byzantine servants to accompany her to the golden bejeweled apartments of his harem. From there he went to his hunting grounds, taking wine and musicians to entertain him, and when he had his fill of hunting the plains and hills, he set off in high spirits for the city. All the roads and buildings were decorated to welcome him, and a confused din of trumpets and songs of welcome resounded through the air. He made a royal, imposing figure as he strode into the high castle. Shirin came forward from the inner apartments and kissed his feet, the ground before him, and his chest. The king turned to his chief priests and said, "I want you to think only well of me. Marry me to this beautiful woman, and give the good news to the world." Then he married her according to the ancient rites that were customary in those days. When the nobility and army learned that Shirin had joined Khosrow Parvis' harem, and that his old relationship had been renewed, the city was filled with discontent, foreboding, and curses. No one approached Khosrow for 3 days, and when the sun rose on the 4th day, Khosrow summoned his nobles to an audience with him. He said, "I have not seen you for a few days, and this has worried me. I am troubled that something troubles you, and your sorrows fill me with anxiety." When he had finished speaking, everyone present held his tongue. and no one gave him an answer. Then, one by one, they looked at the chief priest, who, when he perceived this, stood and addressed Khosrow. "You are just and righteous, my lord. You became king when you were still a young man. You have seen a great deal of both good and evil fortune, and you have heard much good and evil in the world concerning the great and their actions. But now the lineage of our nobility has been polluted. Our greatness has been sullied by this alliance. If the father is pure and the mother is worthless, you should realize that purity cannot issue from them. No man seeks righteousness from a perverse source, which can only harm righteousness. Our hearts are saddened that this vicious demon has become the great king's consort. Is there no other woman in Persia apart from this one who pleases the king? If Shirin were not present in the king's harem, his face would shine with righteousness everywhere. Your ancestors, who were wise and just men, never heard of such a matter." The chief priest spoke at length, but the king of kings gave him no answer. At dawn the next day, the court prepared to assemble. One said the chief priest didn't know what he was talking about. Another said what he said was full of wisdom. A third remarked, "Today the king will answer him. Let's hope he has a good reply." All the counselors made their way into the king's presence, and the nobles took their places there. Then a man came in bearing a bowl that glittered like the sun, and he took it to each of the noblemen in turn. Warm blood had been poured into the bowl, and he offered it gently to each of them, but each man turned his face away. A murmuring spread through the assembly, and everyone looked at the king, afraid of what he would do. Finally, the king said to the Persians gathered there, "Whose blood is this, and why has it been placed in this bowl?" The chief priest said, "This blood is polluted, and everyone who sees it loathes it." He picked up the bowl and had it passed from hand to hand. Then it was cleansed and made shining again with water, and the earth was used to scour it. When the polluted bowl had been purified and shone again, it was filled with wine, with musk and rose water were mixed, and it glowed like the sun. Khosrow Parvis said to the chief priest, "Is the bowl what it was, or has it changed now?" The priest replied, "May your majesty flourish. Good has been distinguished from evil. At your command, what was hellish has become heavenly, and you have made what was ugly beautiful." Khosrow said, "In this land, Shirin was considered to be like that bowl of polluted blood, but the bowl in my harem is now filled with wine. It is my scent that fills her now. Shirin's reputation suffered because of me, and it was because of me that she never sought for a partner among the nobility." All his nobles called down blessings on him, saying, "May the earth never be deprived of your reign. Greatness is increased by your greatness, and those you ennoble are the earth's nobility. You are our king, priest, and guide, and the shadow of God on earth." Then the king's magnificence increased, and if before he had shone like the moon, he was now splendid as the sun. He spent all his time with Miriam, the daughter of the emperor of Byzantine, and she was his favorite of all the women in his harem. Shirin was tormented by this, and her cheeks were always pale with jealousy. Finally, she poisoned Miriam, and the Byzantine princess died. Shirin did this alone, in secret, and no one was aware of what she had done. And a year after Miriam died, Shirin was given the golden apartments in the harem. When Miriam's son, Shirin, was 16, he had the stature of a 30-year-old. His father brought him teachers so that he could learn to be an accomplished nobleman, and a priest supervised him day and night, according to the king's orders. One day the priest came from the king to the prince, and saw that he sat idly playing in front of him lay his book Kalia and Demna, but in his left hand the loutish youth held the dried paw of a wolf, in his right in a buffalo's horn, and he sat there willfully banging the one against the other. The priest's heart was troubled by this pointless game. He took the wolf's claw on the buffalo's horn and the youth's loutish behavior as a bad omen. He had seen the boy's horoscope, and had heard more details from the vizier and court treasurer, and he feared for what fate held in store for the prince. He went to the chief priest and said, "All the prince cares about is trivial games." Immediately the chief priest passed on to Khosrow, who was troubled by the report. His cheeks turned sallow at the thought of his son, and he brooded on what fate would unfold. He remembered the astrologer's words. His heart was troubled, and his vitals were twisted within him. He said, "We must wait to see what heavens bring forth." By the 23rd year of the king's reign, Shirin was strong and fully grown. He had become refractory and uncontrollable, and Khosrow grew anxious about him. The king's smiling soul was clouded with sorrow, and he had the prince confined to his palace, along with his companions, those who sought him out for advice. This group came to be more than 3,000 in all. The palace was provided with clothes, food, and furnishings. The rooms were decorated appropriately, and slaves and servants were there in attendance. The king sent wine and limitless gold, and 40 men were set in watch over the revelers, who passed their time in feasting and pleasure. As time passed, the king's sadness increased, and no one received bad treatment in his court. In the 28th year of his reign, news of this reached the musician Barbad, who was told, "The king favors musicians, and if you compete with his current musician Sarkish, he'll give you a higher rank than him." When he heard this, although he wanted for nothing, ambition flared up in him. He traveled from his own country to the king's court and presented himself to the musicians there. When Sarkish heard him play, he was astonished at the newcomer's skills, and his heart grew dark. He went to the court's chamberlain and gave him gold and silver and other gifts. He said, "There's a musician at the door who surpasses me in youth and skill. He mustn't meet Khosrow's presence, because he does, he'll be looked at as a novelty, and I'll be thought of as old-fashioned." The chamberlain agreed to refuse entry to their naive visitor, and so, when Barbad appeared, he was rudely received. The chamberlains would not admit him to the court, and no one came to help him. Despondently, he left the court gates, and carrying the lute, made his way to the royal garden, where the king would go for 2 weeks of festivities at the new year. The gardener there was named Mardi, and Barbad liked him as soon as he saw him. That very day the two became firm friends, and Barbad said to him, "It's as if you're the soul and I'm the body of one person. I have a favor to ask, something that will be easy for you to do. When the world's king comes to the garden, hide me somewhere so that I can see him. I want to watch his face for a moment during the festivities." Mardi said, "I'll do it. Set your mind at rest." As Khosrow approached the gardens, the gardener's heart glowed with excitement. He hurried to Barbad and said, "The king is coming, here for the celebrations." Barbad dressed himself all in green, and took his lute in his hand, ready to sing of glory and battles. He went to where the king was to sit, since a new site was selected each spring. There was a green cypress tree there, with abundant foliage and branches, interlaced like warriors in a battle. Barbad climbed this tree and waited for the king to arrive. The king came from his palace to the spot that they had prepared for him. A young servant girl with a bewitching face gave him a goblet, and the red wine which rendered its crystal invisible. At the moment the yellow sun set and the purple night came on, Barbad took his lute and sang the heroic song he had prepared. Hidden in the tree, he sang this beautiful lay, the one we now call Dad Afraid, and the king was astonished at the sweetness of his voice. The whole company was amazed, and everyone expressed a different opinion as to what was happening. The king ordered the company to search the area thoroughly, and they looked high and low but came back empty-handed. One experienced man came forward and said, "It should be no surprise that the king's good fortune has made even the green plants and flowers his musicians. May his head and crown flourish forever." The beautiful servant girl brought another goblet, and as the king took it from her, Barbad suddenly struck up another song, the hero's battle. The skillful musician sang, and Khosrow listened, drinking his wine as the song progressed. Then he ordered that the singer be found, and that the garden be turned upside down if need be. They searched everywhere in the garden, taking flaming torches beneath the trees, but they saw nothing but willows and cypresses, and pheasants strutting among the flowers. The king asked for another goblet of wine and leaned his head forward to listen. Again, a song began, accompanied by the lute sound. It was the one that is called Green on Green, and it is used for magical incantations. Khosrow Parvis stood to drink to the voice. He asked for the goblet that held a deep draught of wine, and he drained the bright liquor in one motion. He said, "If this were an angel compounded in musk and ambergris, or a demon, he wouldn't sing these songs, or know how to play that lute in this way. Search the garden again, left and right, until you find him. Where he is, I'll fill his mouth and arms with jewels, and make him the chief of my musicians." When Barbad heard the king's generous words, he came down from the branches of the cypress tree and went forward confidently in all his glory. He approached the king and bowed down, rubbing his face in the dust. Khosrow said to him, "What manner of man are you? Tell me." He replied, "Your Majesty, I am your slave, and live in the world only at your command." Then he told the king all that had happened, and all the men who had befriended him. The king's happiness at seeing Barbad was like that of a spring garden in the moonlight. But he said to Sharkess, "You've no talent. You're as bitter as a colocynth, and Barbad is like sugar. Why did you keep him away from me? Now he's come, you've no place in this assembly." Then he drank wine to the sound of Barbad's voice, draining his goblet of its ruby contents until his head became sleepy, and he filled Barbad's mouth with pearls of the first water. And so Barbad became the king's musician and a respected man among the country's nobility. Now Barbad's tale is done. I wish for you good fortune and good friends in all you do. Despite his splendid throne, the great palace he built at Sisyphon, and all his imperial glory, the world's king was dissatisfied, and he raised dust clouds of strife over Iran and Tehran. The king who had been so just became unjust, and he rejoiced in the injustice of his inferiors. There was a man called Feroxid, the son of Azarmagon, who became Khosrow's chamberlain. He was always frowning, and he acted malevolent toward those who were under his control, stealing people's wealth and pitting them one against the other. He set himself ever new tasks, and all his efforts were to gather even more wealth. Men's former blessings turned to curses, and they said that the ruler who had been like a sheep had become a savage wolf. Since the populace had neither water nor bread nor any means of support, they fled from Persia to enemy lands, and the land was filled with curses against all those who had any part of this oppression. And then there was Gorvaz, a man devoid of virtue, who fulfilled all Khosrow Parvis' dreams and desires, and guarded the frontier against Byzantium. His mind was demons, unjust and shameless, and when the once just king became unjust, he was the first to betray Persia. The next was Feroxid, Khosrow Parvis' favorite and his chamberlain, who would let no one near the king when the king's days were numbered. Feroxid's heart became corrupt. He allied himself with the wily Goraz, and their plot spread from province to province. Goraz wrote to the emperor of Byzantium and stirred up evil desires in him. He wrote, "Rise now and take Persia. If you do, I will be the first to come to your aid." As soon as he read this, the emperor mustered an army and set off with it toward the Persian frontier. When the king heard of this serious development, he dismissed it as of no importance. He knew what was Goraz's doing, and that he had been in secret communication with the Byzantium emperor. Earlier, he had summoned Goraz to the court, but Goraz had made excuses and acted as if the king could not enforce his orders, even though he was afraid of him. The king sat in council with the Persian nobles, and they considered various ways to rid themselves of this problem. Then the king had a clever notion. He wrote a letter to Goraz saying, "I am delighted with what you have done and have praised you before my nobles. When you receive this letter, may it brighten your dark spirits. Wait with your forces where you are until I advance. With one army at this side and another on that, we shall trap the Byzantium emperor between us. We'll bring him back as prisoner to Persia and take all his army into captivity. Then The king chose a cunning courtier, someone who could act as a spy, and said to him, "See that one of the Byzantine scouts catches sight of you and questions you. Then he'll take you to the emperor or to their army's commander. When you're asked who you are, refuse to answer, then say, 'I'm just a poor man trying to make a living, and I've traveled a long way to deliver this letter to Goraz.' Tie the letter to your right arm, and if they take it from you, so much the better." The man tied the letter as instructed and left the court. As he approached the Byzantine march, a man caught sight of him and took him, and with his face covered in dust, his cheeks sallow and his lips purple, before the emperor addressed him. "Where is Khosrow Parvis? You had better tell us the truth." The poor man mumbled in a bewildered way and hung his head in fear. The emperor said, "Search this malevolent, ill-spoken wretch." They found the letter and opened it, and then looked for someone in the area who could read Pahlavi correctly. When a scribe was found who was able to read it, the emperor's face turned black as pitch. He said to himself, "This was a trap set by Goraz. I was marching straight into an ambush. The king, with his army of 300,000 men and innumerable war elephants, wanted to corner me. May his life end in darkness and sorrow." And he withdrew his forces, forgetting all thoughts of conquest. Goraz and Farrokhzad then made common cause and encouraged the army to revolt against Khosrow Parvis. Farrokhzad knew that the king was aware of his treachery, and he did not dare approach the throne. He waited by the door and sounded people out, trying to win allies for when the army would declare itself against the king. He told his ideas to everyone and won many people over, saying that another man should occupy the throne because Khosrow Parvis had forfeited far glory and good fortune. An experienced old man in Farrokhzad's employ said to the master, "The king blames you for the army's disaffection. You shouldn't proceed any farther in this matter until another king is available. Otherwise the country will go to rack and ruin. We must consider his son, which of them has the dignity for this position, and will cause the fewest problems. Then we must place him on the throne in triumph, and pour gold dinars over his crown, as is customary. Since Shirin is his oldest son, he is the obvious choice, even though he is imprisoned at the moment." Everyone expressed the same opinion, and not only did days pass before the dust of Takfur's intrepid army rose up, Farrokhzad went out along the road to greet him and his numerous troops, and the two conversed for a long time. Farrokhzad went over the injustices that the king had committed, and then said, "The army must act with chivalry and discretion and install a new king." The commander replied, "I'm not a man for talk, but when I fight, I make the world a hard place for my enemies. When this king was young, he was loved by champions and lords of marches alike, but may no man make his days as dark as the king has done. He lost everything when he became unjust and rejoiced in the injustice of his inferiors." At this, Farrokhzad chose Takfur from all the Persians as his accomplice, and said to him, "Now we must go to where these poor wretches are imprisoned, and fearlessly free Prince Shirin, who is young and brave and ambitious. His jailer and an army commander," and he said, 6,000 cavalry veterans keep him and his companions under surveillance. Takfur replied, "I take no account of this commander. If Khosrow Parvis' luck revives, every champion in Persia will find himself on a gibbet or imprisoned in a pit. No one will escape injury." Having said this, he urged his horse forward, and it leaped to the fray like lightning. The commander set to guard Shirin come out to oppose him, but he was driven back and killed in the battle. Still in his armor, Takfur went straight to the place where Shirin was confined and called out to him. Shirin knew why this proud warrior had come, and when he saw him, his face glowing after the battle, the young man's heart beat faster with anxiety. Weeping, he said, "Where's Khosrow Parvis? It's not your business to set me free." Takfur said to the prince, "If you're a man, don't stay here like a lion clawing at his gates. If you're not with us, then declare yourself and withdraw. If we lose 1 out of 16 brothers, that's of no importance. There are still 15 more of you. All of the others are worthy to rule, and the throne will rejoice in their reign. Shirin wept in bewilderment, uncertain whether to set foot outside the building or not. And here is where I end my tale for today. But I'll be back tomorrow with more tales. Many more tales. Until then, my friends.